Welcome to On the Brink, a fresh lens to take you and your business to new heights. Hi, I'm Andi Simon. I'm your host today. And as you know, my job is to help you see, feel, and think in new ways so you can adapt to fast-changing times. And the times they are changing. We've always preached that if you want to change, have a crisis or create one. I didn't expect the pandemic to create that crisis, but I do know that across the country, across the globe, business leaders are trying to rethink what they're doing so that they can recreate a viable business for amazingly fast-changing times. So I brought to you today Michelle Richards. Michelle came to me through Delora Tyler, a good friend and colleague in Detroit who I've worked with over the years and who I just adore. She said, you must talk to Michelle because she is the executive director of the Greater Lakes Women's Business Council. She served as executive director since it was formed in 1984. So she has watched us go through many, all kinds of economic upturns, downturns, and so forth. She's a champion for women, minority, and small business owners in the Michigan and Indiana area. And it's really quite exciting to talk to her because their job is to help provide women, not just in the startup, but afterwards. And I often think we forget that once you start a business, growing it requires scalability, funding, insights, training, development, and particularly women who may be starting up or taking over a family firm. So some of the big things that she's concerned about is access to microcredit, because that's often one of the tools needed for economic success, and access to capital is a big issue for women. And she has also led the Great Lakes Women's Business Council as a first microloan program in the country in 1984. And this microloan business loan program has made over 5.5 million in microloans and created 1,800 jobs across Michigan counties alone. I'm really so excited to talk to Michelle today because we are watching carefully to see how women are leading the way to respond to this pandemic and the economic crisis associated with it. Michelle, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Andi. Glad to be here.
And tell the listeners, far better than I can take them through your resume, about Michelle. Talk about your journey. You've been doing this for quite some time. Share with them who you are. And since they're listening and they can't see your smile, let's get them to know you a little bit better before we get into what we're doing here.
Wonderful. Well, my journey began with, I was at the University of Michigan getting a master's degree in social work, specializing in community organizing. And during that period, I realized that my interest was focused on helping women and to create some social change for the position of women. And the fastest way to do that is through economics. And so at that point, I realized that I was probably going to have to put on a blue suit and look like a banker to help women to start, grow, and expand businesses, to be able to leverage economic opportunity for them to be able to create social change within this country. And so that's what I did, and started the Great Lakes Women's Business Council 35 years ago. And it's been a great journey. It's been, it was an interesting process because I was young and I was not taken seriously, and there were no other women's business centers in the country. And I got very used to being told that it was a stupid idea, it was not going to succeed. But being a true social entrepreneur, I come from an entrepreneurial family. My brothers always began businesses. And when they got tired of them, they sold them and started new ideas and new businesses. And so the difference is that I'm willing to do that, but I'm only willing to do it for others. I'm not willing to do it for myself. And then as the organization unfolded, we have developed into this lovely cadre of business development services that really focus on growth. And so now we serve in different capacities businesses that maybe are pretty new and have just had a few sales, to businesses, frankly, that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars who receive our women's business certification. And so it's an extraordinary capacity for us to be able to have something that businesses at any given point can find value in the organization and a reason to be part of it.
You know, before this pandemic set in, the women had now taken on 40% of the businesses in the US. Now, I was always fascinated. African American women had more businesses than African American men. Some of them were considered necessity businesses. And I often wonder, what is not a necessity business? It's sort of like, do you go into business to have fun? I guess, maybe. But most people work because they need to and they might want to. But the impact on women, both who are employed by businesses and those who have their own, has been severely impacted by this shutdown. And reflect about what you're seeing, both in Michigan and the country, as a result of COVID-19. Some of the patterns you're seeing are important to share because some of the folks are really clever and innovative entrepreneurs. Others, even with necessity businesses, are learning how, out of necessity, to reinvent their businesses. Share with our listeners some of the things you're seeing.
Well, and you brought up a really good point to begin with, is that minority women, and especially African American women, are starting businesses at a very fast rate. And in fact, in the Detroit area, it's one of the fastest growing in the country. And so that's part of our service territory and something we're very excited about. What we're seeing both in necessity businesses, but actually across the board in manufacturing, service, and retail, is that the pressure to change went from being, we need to start planning to change, to we have until tomorrow morning to change. And that's an extraordinary pressure, extraordinary. But women-owned businesses, women business leaders instinctively have a certain flexibility and peripheral vision, that they recognize that the path they start on will not be the path they end on. And that's a unique skill, so that they're able to bend instead of breaking. And I think that that's going to serve them well in this environment. And I've seen that. We experienced that in the 2008-2009 economic meltdown. And we have quite a few women, for example, in automotive manufacturing, which was really, ground zero for the economic meltdown. And they lost 50 to 55% of their revenue over a year and a half, and yet they survived. And so it's because of those skill sets they were able to. And so we're trying to implement some of those same sorts of skill sets to help them. One of the differences now that's critical is that innovation and the ability to pivot has to be very quick and thoughtful, but quick. First, and it's not a first to market, it's about survival of market. But what's really interesting today is that technology has been much beyond business. It had expanded way beyond the capabilities of business. And in just a period of a week, this country had to actually test it, and business had to catch up to technology. And that was really extraordinary to see, because we had all the tools we needed to work remotely, to not only work remotely, but to be able to successfully operate a business with your customers, patients, staff, employees, so on, all your stakeholders. And so it's been an extraordinary and very difficult process for most of us.
However, we were working on the fourth industrial revolution before this started.
Yes.
And a third of the workforce, 50 million people, were in the gig economy, either full-time or part-time. And there was more and more people who were testing out remote, decentralized workers. And then, of course, we had AI, and we had bots, we have IoT, we had all kinds of data, and it was coming slowly. And nothing worse or better than a crisis to make it all happen overnight. And I'm fascinated. We have a friend who has a mental health center. 30,000 patients in one day went remote. They all kept their appointments, and their CMS is paying them for it now. We have another client, all remote workforce now. And while they're working now on the culture of the organization, which they're learning really fast, it's working. And their customers are working. Everything changed, but it hasn't disappeared. So, give us some of both the stuff we learned in 2008 and 2009 that we're learning again, but also some of the illustrative cases where people are really finding opportunity out of this.
Well, what's interesting is that some of the best technology that we use came out of 2008, 2009, both from a social media standpoint, from a business operations, Dropbox, Square, Instagram, Slack, WhatsApp, Uber, Groupon, all came out of 2008, 2009, which is extraordinary. They're all brands that we're very familiar with. And so, as you had pointed out, the necessity created. We don't like change until we have to, and the necessity created change. What we're seeing now are, I have two really interesting women-owned businesses that have changed dramatically as a point of necessity and very quickly. One, in fact, has received some significant television coverage because of its success. It's called GDC Corporation, and it's in Indiana, and they are in the automotive supply chain, and they make acoustical automotive fabric. And when General Motors overnight, it seems like a company that takes, half a year to make a change, overnight went from making cars to making ventilators and masks. And so over the weekend, this company, this woman-owned company, figured out how to take this acoustical automotive fabric that they had been producing in very large quantities in this big manufacturing facility, and being able to thin it out so that it meets the requirements for medical grade masks. And over that weekend, they figured it out, and by the end of the week, they had been producing these masks the materials on behalf of General Motors.
Don't you love it?
Extraordinary.
Yes.
And this is a third generation business. And so for 50 or 60 years, they were focusing in one direction. And in 1 week, they pivoted into another direction.
Now, this is a woman-owned business now?
Yes.
And is there something unique about her, or does she reflect women who take on their family firm?
It reflects women's leadership skills, like I said, in terms of that they recognize that the path will change. And so they have a sense, women generally, again, we have the same values as men, but we weigh out certain values differently. And one of the things is community need. Women's owned businesses have historically, through the assessments, will hire more employees for the same size business as a male-owned business. We're more likely to be much more focused on our employees and the community at large and how this business is serving it. And I have some great examples too of that, how they've done that. So I think it just comes with the skill set of what we expect from really good women business leaders.
The reason I ask that is that over history, and I'm an anthropologist, men have typically dominated society in terms of control. But women have been able to help them do that by building the communities that are being, that they live in. And I'm finding, as I do my research on women leaders, that their style is different, but my gosh, how successful they are in that style. It's not command and control. It's very entrepreneurial. It's very maze-like. It's nobody owns it. It's sort of like, how can we, not I, create the new together, and everybody thrives. It's interesting. I have a hunch you've seen the same.
Collaborative leadership is a really common style for women business leaders, and it tends to work for them well. It makes them comfortable bringing people along instead of dictating the vision. So they have the ability to have a shared vision, which also gives them that capacity, again, to look at changing direction, because they're not egocentric on a given direction.
And what I love about it is that they can enable their staff together to believe that they can. And guess what? They can. And sort of, it doesn't take a lot to turn lemons into lemonade when you believe you can. And so it's cool. You shared with me another story that I thought was really important to share with our folks as well. Green Gifts. It's a wonderful story.
Well, Green Gifts is a fabulous business. They produce mostly, again, giveaways or products that are usually branded with a corporation name. And what's interesting is that they recycle materials to make things like stylish shopping bags, satchels, and purses. In fact, Some airports here in Michigan carry their products. They love them and keep ordering them because their customers just eat them up. What they've done in the last 30 days to pivot to address, again, community need, because as you know, Michigan's been heavily hit with the COVID-19 epidemic, is that they're now not just recycling, but now they're focusing on upcycling, and they're purchasing cotton shirts. Let's say a company buys 10,000 shirts with their logo branded, and they decide to change their logo or their logo color all of a sudden, which happens all the time. All those shirts have been purchased by Green Gifts to convert into masks. So they're using brand new material, and they're able to then reuse it make it purposeful, since it no longer had a purpose. And they are doing just a fabulous job, again, meeting community needs here, and also sticking to their value system of not utilizing more materials in this world that need to be used, but to use repurpose materials.
It's interesting listening to you, because I hope our listeners begin to pick up on the message that things do change. And while we may not be hunters and gatherers who all of a sudden discovered the species we were hunting, those gazelles aren't there anymore, so we got to find something else to eat. But in some ways, it is very different. And we have an opportunity to really rise to the occasion if we see possibilities. I was doing a workshop in Los Angeles not long ago, remotely. And some of the folks were wondering, once they pivoted, what will come next? And the interesting conversation was, how do we take these skills and turn them into ongoing skills? What do we see? We preach what's outside in. What do people need, not what do you make? And how do you solve them? Because that's what these women are doing, is taking what people need and finding ways to solve them. Well, what are you seeing as you think about all the women who are part of your organization and across the country? Are we going to lead the way out of this?
I think that there's going to be some really strong leaders emerging from this, and certainly women business owners, because of the key tools. First of all, we have the technology exists to support all of these visions and ideas. Business is just catching up to them. And it was like overnight, over this one week, we all went, wow, we have all these tools. We've never really looked into it. We've had these subscriptions, and all we did was use it. It's kind of like me and my iPhone. I mean, at first I was like texting and phone calls, and not even looking at the whole world, that it could basically do everything for me, except for make coffee in the morning. And then the second is that innovation and flexibility are no longer choices, but necessities for business survival. And I think that women business owners recognize that. That's not a choice anymore. And so what we're going to see is, in terms of the kinds of innovation and pivoting, we're going to see a lot of technology-driven solutioning that hadn't been thought of. I think we're going to see some practicing, some trying out things. But again, they tend to be very inclusive in terms of leadership, very concerned with collaborating with their team and seeing their employees as stakeholders. Secondarily, they are very customer focused instinctively. We are very, we've been well bred and raised to be focused on other people's needs. And actually, we never realized that in business now, that is the current trend and model, and serves us very well. And so what we'll see is some refinements. We're going to see whether you go back to a bricks and mortar situation, that it's more than an online presence, but communication through technology and other pieces will continue to be there, because we will never know when we have to pivot again.
Yes.
The one thing we should have learned through this is that this is not the last time we'll have a pandemic. We're hoping that the country itself is better prepared so that we do not end up having to socially isolate for such a long period of time. But nevertheless, we have to make steps to ensure that our businesses will be able to be successful that day.
Well, it's interesting. We have healthcare clients, and we had to take and put on the internet their telemedicine over a weekend. And we've been talking about telemedicine for 10 years now. And, the Children's Health Fund did it, almost 15 years ago. It took a long time for them to realize that telehealth is actually good health. And it also is a multiplier. You can see a lot more people telehealth-wise than you can in person. And it's perfectly okay for them to come and diagnose something remotely. And if you need something, you can. So all of a sudden, what we had turned into an opportunity of enormous potential. Of course, they had to tell the doctors about it as well. And we had to wait a week before we could launch it. But it was a very interesting opportunity. And I do think across the entire spectrum, we're going to be seeing it. Do you find the capital is coming too? Because the biggest problem women have is access to funding. And you can only self-fund up to a point when there's no income coming through. Do you think people are rising with the micro loans that I've always been a great fan of, but other things, including the PPP, is there money flowing in?
Yeah, so I think that those are two really critical pieces. The first is about women and access to capital. And I've had a chance to speak to both the House and the Senate Small Business Committees about this a couple of times in the last 2 years. Women receive less than 16% of all of the small business loan dollars, which is extraordinary considering we represent 40-some% of all the businesses. And so there's some good questions about why. And so part of it is that while we do have a lot of legislation that really protects the rights of women as business owners, the truth is continued practices of banks still carry some institutionalization of being able to make decisions that are discretionary, especially as it relates to small business versus personal credit and home mortgage. And so that's a loop that really needs to be closed. The second is that we need more women firms like venture capital angel firms, angel investors who are willing to invest, because one of the problems is women tend to be very fearful about taking debt and equity investors together in the angel and venture capital areas. And that's what you really need to create high scalability. So that is true. Now, we started as a microlender and we've become a community development financial institution. So our goal is to, in the next year, being able to make loans up to $250,000. There are a lot of opportunities. Now, I know the Congress set aside this massive amount of money that sort of blew our minds away. And yet those loans went out the door so fast, it just felt like overnight. And so there's going to be a lot of people who are really distressed about not being able to get the Paycheck Protection Program loan or the disaster loan, but there's still a lot of resources in your community depending on the size. So the first is that you've got to find people in the community who are true ambassadors for finance. So one will be, if you look up under SBA.gov, the resources in your state. So the microloan programs very frequently are community development financial institutions, and right now many of them have loans and can provide community access loans up to $250,000. Many of them have funds that came through, state programs to provide grants. And then secondarily, you have to look at the women's business centers and other resources in the community, the chambers, who might know of what opportunities right now there are. My only concern is don't chase programs that aren't going to work for you. Have conversations with people about where it is you need to be tomorrow and not today. Our first instinct is to fill the hole for today and worry about tomorrow. And that's not a plan. That's just, that's not even a life preserver. That's a little floaty you're hoping doesn't have a hole tomorrow and sink. And so there are resources. The first thing is to not panic, take inventory of what you really need, and then invite people in to help you problem solve and come up with a plan, because there are resources. There's always been a lot of resources. They may not have been your first choice, but you got to socialize it within your group and figure out how you can make this work.
So if you can't follow our theme today, and how do we turn this into an opportunity? What you are really offering is that it's a good time to pause for a moment, think about your strategy for growth, and then how this funding could be capitalized on so that it isn't a band-aid for the moment, but it really is going to give you what you need to get somewhere. And that goes back to your purpose, how you're going to create a new market, and the uncertainties. We often, uh, people hate uncertainty. Humans want to be in a black box or a white box, not in a gray one. And what we've been preaching, it's time to create a new sandbox. And you're entrepreneurial, you've started businesses, you've grown them to a point. It's a good time to pause, step back, and say, in the new world that's coming that we're not particularly certain of, I'm going to go look for funding for us, a real important stage in our growth where we're going to open up using new. I mean, you can make up a great story now about how you're going to take this and capitalize on it. And I think that's what you're urging people to do. Don't just jump, know where you're going and how to get there. Am I right?
Absolutely, because new narratives are going to be written all the time. With these market shifts, great opportunities are created, and I shared some of the kinds of really big successes that came out of the economic meltdown. And so it's someone who says, this is what I see it looking like. Instead of worrying about getting back to where we were before, because before it's not going to exist. Think about what it's going to look like in a year, not tomorrow, in a year. And figure out the plan to get there.
Well, and stay on that, because your customers are changing too. Help them in the process. It's a great time to have great conversations with those customers, whether they're consumers or their businesses, and think collaboratively. I've been urging some of my clients to stop competing, but to create a market, perhaps even with your competition. There was too much supply and not enough demand before this. How can you together you each have different strengths? Why are you competing? Maybe it's time for us to collaborate. What do you think?
And that's actually one of the ways that we, that is programming that we provide for our women, is that you haven't had enough capital, you have enough capacity in terms of your leadership and intelligence, but how do you get your business to that capacity? And so we talk about teaming, and whether it is a new business together, or whether it's a strategic alliance, that kind of leverage growth is what the big guys do. Major corporations one day might compete against another for a contract, and then next week they're going in together to get a big government contract or something. You have to be nimble enough to know when to compete, when to cooperate, and when to come together and become a team. And that is a successful toolkit.
Well, and I think that's often underestimated. People think about my business, the way we do it here, only to discover, you don't have to do it alone. And there's just an opportunity now to rethink everything. This has been such fun. Michelle, for our listeners, one or two things that you don't want them to forget as we begin to wrap up.
What I would say is this: don't become discouraged because of the government programs right now running out of money. There's places in the community where you can find them. Find your ambassadors, build your team. The second is keep your eye on, what do you really think this is going to look like in a year, instead of trying to get back to what it looked like before, because the rest of the world is going to be somewhere else. They're not going to be back there. And so that will bring you more success going forward. And it's uncomfortable for change. And we talked about that several times. But allow that process to happen.
When Michelle was referred to me, the woman who referred her said she just champions us. She's got a way of making the difficult seem possible. And I just love talking to you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Andi. That's lovely.
Well, it's been lovely sharing. Sometimes we're out there as consultants far too alone, and I'm glad to be able to bring to our listeners Michelle Richards, because I do think her wisdom is profound, and I also know that she's available to talk some more. Michelle, if they want to reach you, how could they do that?
Well, they can reach me through first our website, which is greatlakeswbc.org. or through my email at mrichards@greatlakeswbc.org. And then our office number, in case you would like to speak to one of the team members, if I'm not available, is 734-677-1400. And because our organization was prepared for the potential, if you call, there's no one in the office, but those calls are sent on to the cell phones of the team, and we will handle any calls that come in.
So we are already preparing to be a great business council for women in the future, where we may or may not come into an office. And it should be an interesting next phase because I can feel us coming out and some innovation coming along. So for those of you who join us, I can't tell you how much we appreciate your emails. It's fun to hear from you. You're bringing us people who you'd like us to interview, and we appreciate that. And I do think that the times, they are changing, as Bob Dylan sang to us not so long ago, but a long time ago. And it's a great time for you to stop saying, oh, we don't do that, and instead say, how can we do that? And begin to think creatively about what the future offers. It's full of opportunity. You know, every entrepreneur hears, you can't, you won't, it won't, and then they do it and they say, oh, that was obvious. Well, someone is going to make this all obvious. So we look forward to hearing from you. It's info@andysimon.com or info@simonassociates.net. And I promise you'll have Michelle Richards' information on that blog post as this podcasting comes out. Thanks again for joining us. Please have a healthy and safe day and enjoy life. Bye now.